I've been, so privileged to be given this opportunity to do something for children. What UNICEF wants to do is to give them a spade to dig their water wells, but not to dig the graves of their children.
She was the most sophisticated woman ever created in Hollywood. From the outside, the life appeared to be a fairy tale. 2 husbands, a series of heartbreaks. However, Audrey Hepburn discreetly identified the one man she never really moved on from in her last months. It wasn't a spouse, it wasn't a co-star, and her entire life appears quite different when you discover who it was. They appeared to be the ideal fit at first glance. From a distance, Ferrer appeared to be the ideal partner for Audrey Hepburn since he was well-educated, multilingual, and passionate about the arts. They were placed together in the theatrical version of Undine after meeting through Gregory Peck in the early 1950s, and once they began working together, whatever spark they had off stage became unavoidable. They were wed in a low-key ceremony in Switzerland by September 1954. Ferrer took an active role in shaping Audrey's career, and she, still finding her footing in Hollywood despite the extraordinary speed of her rise, genuinely welcomed the guidance. Having someone in her corner who understood the industry, who had opinions about which roles to take and which to decline, felt like stability. But there is a thin and easily crossed line between guidance and control. Over time, that line disappeared entirely. People close to the couple began noticing the shift. Ferrer had opinions about everything, not just the roles she accepted, but how she presented herself publicly, who she spent time with, what she said in interviews. What had started as a creative alliance quietly became something more suffocating. Audrey was one of the most recognizable women on earth, and yet inside that marriage, she deferred. Consistently, visibly, to a degree that people who cared about her found increasingly difficult to watch. And then there was the question of children. Audrey's desire to become a mother outweighed practically everything else in her life, including celebrity, critical acclaim, and the status of cultural icon that was around her whether she wanted it or not. It wasn't an idle wish. In ways she was just starting to comprehend at the time, it was something she carried with a profound, nearly painful immediacy that connected to her own broken-up upbringing. Her first pregnancy ended in miscarriage in 1955. The loss was deep and mostly personal. Then, while filming The Unforgiven in Mexico in 1959, she became pregnant once more. She was tossed during a sequence where she had to ride a horse. Her back was broken by the fall. We spent weeks in the hospital. Then there was another miscarriage. Loss piled on top of loss, all taking place within a marriage that was gradually and silently closing in on her. In 1960, she finally gave birth to her first son, Sean. For a brief, stabilizing moment, it felt like things might hold. She stepped back from acting for a full year, something almost unheard of for someone at her level of fame, and devoted herself entirely to motherhood. But the marriage kept eroding underneath the surface. The rumors that had swirled for years grew louder. Ferrer's temper, his jealousy, and eventually, infidelity on both sides. After 14 years, it ended. Audrey walked away emotionally drained, privately devastated, but free in a way she hadn't been in over a decade. What she didn't know was that the next relationship would hurt her in an entirely different way. By the late 1960s, Audrey Hepburn was not just a film star. She was a cultural institution. Charade for Breakfast at Tiffany's, My Lovely Lady, Roman Holiday. The list of pivotal movies was so vast that studios were more interested in giving her whatever she wanted, including co-stars, directors, scripts, and terms, than in giving her roles. Almost anything would have suited her. Then she abruptly turned her back on everything. Hollywood was perplexed. Her disappearance was interpreted by the industry as a brief retreat, a break between projects, and a time for introspection prior to her unavoidable return. Even if it was hard for an industry centered on a desire for recognition to comprehend, Audrey had made up her mind for a straightforward reason. She wished to provide her son Sean with the upbringing she was denied. She had come to the conclusion that fame was beginning to cost him something she was unwilling to give up. She met Andrea Dotti on a summer Mediterranean cruise during this time of intentional retreat. He was an Italian psychiatrist, charming, warm, socially at ease in a way that felt like a relief after the controlled atmosphere of her first marriage. The setting was almost unfairly romantic. Historical coastlines, open water, long evenings with nothing to interrupt them. Within 6 months, they were married. Audrey moved to Rome, leaned into the idea of a quieter life, wife, mother, private person. For a brief stretch, it looked like exactly the version of herself she had described wanting. but Dottie had kept a version of himself carefully out of view during those Mediterranean evenings. The affair started early. They didn't stop, and they were not discreet. Reports of his extramarital relationships became a regular feature of the Italian press, the paparazzi who had followed Audrey relentlessly, making sure nothing stayed private. The cruelty of the situation was specific. She had left Hollywood expressly to escape the intrusion of public life, to exist outside the spectacle. And she had walked directly into a different kind of spectacle, one she hadn't chosen and couldn't control. She stayed longer than most had anticipated. 2 marriages, 2 very different kinds of disappointment. And underneath both of them, a pattern that stretched back much further than either relationship. Because the pattern didn't start with Ferrer or Dottie. It started when she was 6 years old. Audrey Hepburn was born in Brussels in 1929. Her early years were fleeting since the family frequently relocated between Arnhem, London, and other places due to the career and varied interests of her father, Joseph Ruston. She was fluent in 6 languages when she was still relatively young. It appeared to be an affluent, cosmopolitan childhood from the outside. Underneath, something even more unstable was taking place. In the 1930s, both of her parents had publicly backed the Nazi government. Actively, not silently. They visited Germany, went to demonstrations, and openly supported its ideas. Her father then departed in 1935. He moved to London and completely abandoned Audrey and her mother because he was so engrossed in fascist politics. She was 6 years old. She was sent to boarding school in Kent. She watched other children go home during holidays. She waited for her father, who had visitation rights and never used them. He simply didn't come. No explanation that could be fully understood by a child. No adequate substitute for his presence. Just the recurring, accumulating evidence that she was not worth returning to. Then the war began, and Audrey was sent to the Netherlands, where her mother's family had roots and where it was believed she would be safer. It was not safer. In 1940, German forces invaded. She was 10 years old, hiding in cellars while gunfire moved through the streets above her. She adopted a Dutch name, Etta van Heemstra, to avoid being identified as English. In 1942, 2 of her uncles were arrested and executed by the Nazis. She joined the Dutch resistance. She carried messages in underground newspapers, sometimes hidden in her shoes. She danced at secret fundraisers for the resistance, in rooms where the audience couldn't applaud because a single sound might expose all of them. Ballet had been her entire dream before the war. Now she used it as cover and as contribution simultaneously, in the dark, for people who couldn't acknowledge what she was giving them. During one of the worst winters ever recorded in 1944, starvation had swept through the Netherlands. Food supplies had been cut off by German blockades. Tulip bulbs were consumed by Audrey's relatives. Malnutrition, anemia, and a respiratory ailment that would plague her for the remainder of her life all contributed to her declining health. At that time, the girl who would go on to become one of the most photographed women of the 20th century was a malnourished adolescent in an occupied nation, wearing someone else's name and waiting for a father who had never returned. When liberation finally came, a UNICEF worker pressed a chocolate bar into her hands. She never forgot it, not for the rest of her life. Decades later, using the Red Cross, she tracked down Joseph Ruston. He had been living in Dublin since 1939, the same year he had driven her to the airport and sent her away. And what she found at that reunion explains, in ways nothing else quite does, the shape of every major decision she made after it. She had carried the idea of that reunion for decades. Not in a bitter way. Audrey Hepburn was not built for sustained bitterness. And the war had long since taught her that bitterness was a luxury no one in real suffering could afford. But she had carried it. The possibility that if she found him, if she stood in front of him, something might be said that would close what had stayed open in her since she was 6. Some acknowledgement, some warmth, some form of repair that would let her put the wound down. What she found was a man who offered almost nothing. He was aloof, indifferent in a way that was merely absent even when present rather than hostile, which would have at least been a form of interaction. Over the course of 30 or so years, she had imagined a reconciliation, but it never materialized. He didn't have a satisfactory explanation. He could not offer any warmth. When she finally sat across from the guy she had been waiting for through 14 years of a stifling marriage, miscarriages, and military occupation, he was practically a stranger who just happened to share her last name. She forgave him anyway. More than forgave him, she supported him financially for the rest of his life. Sent money, maintained contact. carried him as a responsibility without being asked to, because in some deep and essentially unalterable part of herself, he was still her father and she had learned to love people who didn't know how to love her back. That detail says more about Audrey Hepburn than almost any performance she ever gave on screen. Joseph Ruston's abandonment has been identified by psychologists and biographers who have thoroughly examined her life as the fundamental lens through which practically everything else must be viewed. Throughout her adult life, the guys she was drawn to were typically older, powerful, and in charge. They had a fatherly demeanor. Ferrer was a perfect fit for that description. Dottie mirrored it in his own way. She had self-awareness and was not naive. However, the emotional architecture that was established during childhood is not automatically superseded by self-awareness. Unbeknownst to her, she was looking for the security her father had left behind. He died without giving her what she had gone looking for. But before any of that, before Ferrer, before Dottie, before the reunion in Dublin, there was one man who showed more clearly than anyone else just how guarded she had already become by the time she reached adulthood. The set of Sabrina in 1954 was already uncomfortable before filming began. Humphrey Bogart had wanted the female lead to go to his wife, Lauren Bacall. When the studio chose Audrey instead, he made no effort to conceal his resentment. He kept his distance, treated her as an intruder on a set he felt she hadn't earned the right to be on, and communicated his displeasure through the pointed indifference that only seasoned Hollywood professionals can deploy with real precision. William Holden responded to her in the exact opposite way. He was utterly captivated by her from their first encounters on set. Their chemistry was genuine, apparent to everyone in their immediate vicinity, and rapidly intensified. It was neither created for the cameras nor beneficial for PR. What started out as intimacy during production developed into something more behind the scenes, and it was quite intense for a while. Men who don't typically fall hard occasionally do so when they encounter someone they weren't prepared for, and Holden fell hard in the full unguarded way. He asked her to marry him. Audrey said no. The reason was not complicated, but it was final. She wanted children. Holden had already undergone a vasectomy. That was not a detail she could find a way around or set aside with noble intentions. The future she had been building in her mind since childhood, the one with children at its center, the one that was the mirror image of what she hadn't had, required something he could not give her. As much as she felt for him, the feeling wasn't enough to change what she needed. Holden was heartbroken in a way that didn't fully resolve. He never entirely moved on from her. Those who knew him well in later years noted that her name still carried weight when it came up, decades after Sabrina. What this moment reveals is not that Audrey was cold or calculating. It reveals how early and how completely she had learned that wanting someone and trusting them with your future were two entirely different decisions. Love for her existed inside a structure of practical reality that her childhood had built around it without her permission. She could feel something real and still walk away from it, because staying in a situation that couldn't provide her what she most needed was something her history had already taught her to recognize and refuse. The wound her father left had shaped her before she even understood it was doing so. After 2 failed marriages and this heartbreak she had consciously chosen to walk away from, Audrey finally found something she hadn't expected and hadn't known she was still capable of receiving. After the divorce from Andrea Dottie, she did not move in a temporary or strategic manner. She moved to a farmhouse in Tolochenaz, Switzerland, a place she called La Paisible, which translates simply as the peaceful place. The name was not accidental. It was a declaration. She turned down major roles. She avoided the social circuit that had orbited her for 30 years. She spent her days in her garden, walked her dogs through the Swiss countryside, cooked meals, and lived in a way that would have been entirely unrecognizable to anyone who knew only the Audrey Hepburn of Roman Holiday and Breakfast at Tiffany's. Neighbors in Tolochenaz later recalled her simply as a neighbor, someone who said good morning at the market and didn't need to perform anything beyond that. It was in this period of deliberate quiet that Robert Wolders came into her life. In the late 1970s, they met at a charity auction. Wolders was a Dutch businessman and actor who had recently lost his wife, the actress Merle Oberon, due to a protracted illness. He had also, in his own way, experienced enough to know what was important and what wasn't. On the surface, their initial conversation was unremarkable. Soon after, he invited her somewhere. She said no because she had a job, but she made contact the next day. She proposed that they get together for a drink. That drink turned into an hour-long chat. The hours turned into regular phone conversations. Neither of them had intended for or expected the phone calls to turn into what they did. What they built together was not glamorous. That was precisely the point. Both had lived through enough loss and enough public exposure and enough relationships that had required them to be something other than themselves. What they offered each other was simpler than anything either had experienced in a long time. Steadiness, genuine respect, a shared preference for the unhurried and the real over the spectacular and the performed. They never married formally. Audrey didn't feel the need, and the absence of paperwork said nothing about the depth of the commitment. She introduced him as her husband, not because the legal document existed, but because in every way that actually mattered to her, it was already true. For over a decade, they shared Paisible, its garden, its rhythms, its long and undemanding silences. Then, in 1988, she found the final chapter of her purpose. She attended a UNICEF concert in 1988 simply as a guest. She hadn't gone to be recruited. She hadn't gone to make a statement or extend her public profile. She went because the cause mattered to her in a way she had never stopped feeling since the moment liberation came and a stranger pressed a chocolate bar into the hands of a starving teenager in the Netherlands. She found herself standing on the stage that evening, speaking without notes or preparation about hunger, about occupation, about what it meant to be a child whose safety had disappeared. A senior UNICEF official was in the audience. By the time the evening ended, he had offered her a full ambassadorship. She accepted without hesitation. In the years that followed, she traveled to some of the world's most challenging and resource-poor places, including Ethiopia, Sudan, Bangladesh, and El Salvador. She sat with kids in situations that were almost unbearably similar to what she had experienced 50 years earlier in the Netherlands. She didn't view this labor as a duty, a cause, or a project with clear goals, according to those who accompanied her on these expeditions. She handled it as if it were incomplete. She felt a particular obligation to the version of herself that a UNICEF worker had once discovered famished and given a piece of chocolate. Robert Wolders traveled with her on many of these missions, not as a manager or a handler or someone navigating a celebrity schedule, but as someone who had looked at the hardest parts of what she was doing and simply refused to let her do them alone. In 1992, after returning from a humanitarian trip to Somalia, she began experiencing severe abdominal pain. Testing in Los Angeles revealed pseudomyxoma peritoniae, a rare and aggressive form of cancer originating in the appendix. Surgery was performed quickly. The disease had already spread too far. The diagnosis was terminal. She absorbed that news the way she had absorbed most of the difficult things in her life, without visible collapse, without the performance of devastation. Those around her in those final months spoke about her composure in terms that edged close to awe because it was so complete and so clearly not a mask. What she expressed was not fear of dying but grief about the work she would leave unfinished, the children she wouldn't be able to reach. She had one request: to go home. She was too delicate to go on business trips. A private jet was organized and the trip was made possible by Hubert de Givenchy, her friend of almost 40 years, and the designer who had dressed her throughout the most famous moments of her public life and sat with her during the more private ones. She arrived home to Paisible. She spent a final Christmas there, surrounded by the people who mattered most to her. In a gesture that everyone who was present described as quietly and completely characteristic of her, she gave carefully chosen gifts. Winter coats for the three men she was closest to: Wolders, her son Sean, and Givenchy. Practical, warm, specific to each person. On January 20, 1993, she died peacefully at home. The little village church in Tolokanaz hosted her funeral. She would have wanted it to be intimate. Standing at the front and reading one of her favorite poems was Gregory Peck, her co-star from Roman Holiday 40 years prior, the man who had insisted she get equal billing on a movie in which no one outside of Belgium had yet heard of her. There were her ex-husbands. There were her boys. Among them stood Robert Wolders. So who was he? After 2 failed marriages, after Holden, after all of it, who was the man Audrey Hepburn kept returning to in her final months and final interviews? Who was the one she named, with a consistency that those who knew her found striking and somewhat difficult to sit with, as the one she never truly got over? It wasn't a romantic partner. That's the part most people get wrong when they come to this story expecting a love affair. It was her father, not in a sentimental way, not in the soft, nostalgic register of someone who misses a person they simply loved, in the way a wound that never properly closes continues to shape every room it enters, long after the original injury is technically over. Joseph Ruston left when she was 6. He didn't come when she waited at school during holidays. He sent her to the Netherlands believing it would be safer. And when she landed in the middle of an occupation and a war and a famine, he wasn't there. When she found him through the Red Cross decades later, living quietly in Dublin, the same city he'd been in since the year he drove her to the airport and sent her away, he greeted the reunion she had imagined for 30 years with indifference. She had built an entire emotional mythology around a man who had almost nothing to give her when she finally stood in front of him. And she still forgave him. She still supported him financially. She still carried him. People close to Audrey found it both startling and subtly upsetting to see how consistently she returned to him in interviews done in the last years of her life. Not with rage. Decades ago, she had long since moved past rage with a sort of unanswered curiosity. What was going through his mind when he departed? Did he ever experience the absence in the same way that she did? Perhaps there had been something genuine inside of him that was just unable to escape. Whether things might have turned out differently if she had taken a different action. He died without giving her a satisfying answer. He died without giving her much of anything. And she spent her entire life in the shape of that absence, choosing men who carried his structural profile, staying in situations past the point they deserved, forgiving people who hadn't earned it, because her emotional default had been set at 6 years old to love someone who didn't come back. The same argument has been made by every significant biographer who has been given access to her private correspondence and the testimonies of those who were close to her in Switzerland, the elder men, the people in charge, the readiness to remain in partnerships long after the circumstances warranted it. Even her work for UNICEF, which she called the most significant project of her life, had a very personal quality. She was particularly drawn to troubled kids, kids who had lost the frameworks they relied on. Kids are waiting for someone to arrive. She once said, in one of the most frequently quoted lines from her later interviews, that she believed the best thing you could leave your children was the feeling of being loved. It was a simple statement, the kind that can be quoted in greeting cards and graduation speeches without losing its surface meaning. But given everything she had lived through, and given the particular, specific shape of what she had spent her entire life looking for, it was not a simple statement at all. It was the thing she had needed most and received least from the first person who should have given it without condition. And she spent the rest of her life, through her parenting, through her humanitarian work, through the quiet steadiness of what she built with Wolders at Paisible, trying to give it to everyone she could reach. Although Audrey's talent and beauty were obvious, Robert Wolders, who knew her better in her last 10 years than nearly everyone alive, later stated that it wasn't these qualities that most impressed him. It was her ability to forgive, not the simple variety, which doesn't cost anything because the injury was minor and there was enough time. The kind where you have to keep loving someone even when you have very little reason to do so. The kind that persists despite the fact that the individual never returns and never gives an explanation. She never stopped loving her father. She never stopped grieving him. And in that long, unresolved grief, in the space between those two things that should not be able to coexist and somehow always did in her, is perhaps the truest and most complete portrait of who Audrey Hepburn really was. Not the black dress, not the pearls, not the effortless grace on screen that the world spent 40 years trying to define and replicate. A girl who waited through a war for someone who didn't come, who spent her entire adult life trying to make sure no one else ever had to feel what that felt like, and who died at home in Switzerland surrounded by people who stayed. That is who she was. And that is the story she was telling in everything she ever did, from beginning to end.